My name is Emma Brooks. I am 32 years old. I founded a healthcare analytics company that helps hospitals detect billing fraud before it costs them millions of dollars. For the last 8 years, I've made a career out of finding patterns other people overlook. Hidden transactions, false narratives, tiny inconsistencies that eventually expose much larger lies. It's strange how those skills never helped me understand my own family. At least not until it was too late. 4 years ago, my mother looked me in the eyes and called my college graduation a failure's ceremony. Not a celebration, not an achievement, a failure's ceremony. She didn't whisper it. She didn't say it in anger. She said it with the same calm voice people use when commenting on the weather, as though dismissing the hardest years of my life required no emotion at all. I graduated anyway, at the top of my program. While my classmates celebrated with their parents, the only person standing in the audience crying with pride was my grandmother Grace. Everyone else was somewhere else. My mother was hosting a charity luncheon in Boston. My father attended because appearances mattered. My younger sister Sophie spent the afternoon posting smiling family photos online. Those photographs received hundreds of likes. My graduation received nothing. I promised myself that day I would never again mistake shared DNA for unconditional love. For a while, I kept that promise. Then success made my phone ring. 3 weeks ago, I finalized the sale of my company. The acquisition had been in negotiations for months, but once the paperwork became public, business magazines started publishing headlines that my family couldn't ignore. Apparently, becoming worth millions is an excellent way to remind people you exist. The first call came from my mother. Her voice sounded warmer than I had heard in decades. "Emma," she said softly, "we've all been thinking about you." No, they hadn't. Not when I was working 3 jobs to pay tuition. Not when I graduated. Not when my grandmother was dying. Only now. She invited me to what she called a family reconciliation dinner at my parents' home outside Boston. She said life was too short to hold on to old misunderstandings. She said Grandma would have wanted us together again. I almost laughed. My grandmother knew my family better than anyone. If she'd wanted us together, she would have said so. Instead, I simply replied, "I'll think about it." 10 minutes later, my father called. 5 minutes after that, Sophie texted. It was almost impressive. 4 years of silence, followed by 15 minutes of relentless enthusiasm. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Still, I accepted the invitation. Not because I believed anyone had changed, because people who suddenly become interested in reconciliation usually want something. And I'd spent my entire adult life investigating motives. The dinner was held the following Saturday evening. Their house looked exactly the way I remembered. Perfect landscaping, fresh flowers by the entrance, every window spotless, everything carefully designed to convince strangers that happiness lived inside those walls. A valet opened my car door before I even reached the front steps. That was new. So were the luxury SUVs parked in the driveway. My mother greeted me with a hug. A hug. The same woman who hadn't attended my graduation wrapped both arms around me as though we'd always been close. "It's so good to have you home," she said. Home. That word felt almost insulting. Inside, nearly 20 guests were already gathered. Relatives, family friends, a few business associates. Everyone smiled a little too brightly. Everyone suddenly seemed fascinated by my career. For years I had been the difficult daughter. Tonight, I was apparently the guest of honor. Dinner passed with uncomfortable politeness. People asked about my company, my travels, my future plans, questions they had never cared enough to ask before. Then, just as dessert was being served, my mother gently tapped her wineglass with a spoon. The room fell silent. She stood and smiled at everyone. "I have one final surprise." She nodded toward my father. He disappeared into the study before returning with a leather presentation folder. He placed it directly in front of me. Gold lettering across the cover read, "The Grace Sullivan Legacy Foundation." My grandmother's name. The moment I saw it, something inside me tightened. My mother smiled warmly. "We've created something beautiful in your grandmother's honor." She slowly opened the folder. "Our family will finally come together to continue her legacy." The proposal looked polished: professional, scholarships, community outreach, support for children from broken homes. Every page was beautifully designed. Then I reached the final section. Founding family contribution. Emma Brooks, $500,000. I looked up. No one spoke. 20 pairs of eyes waited for my reaction. My mother rested her hand lightly on mine. "I knew Grandma would have wanted you to lead this with us." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I quietly closed the folder. "I'll need time to review everything." Her smile faltered. "It doesn't need reviewing." "It absolutely does." The atmosphere changed instantly. My father leaned forward. "It's only a donation." "No." I looked directly at him. "It's a legal commitment." "And I don't sign legal commitments without reading every page." For just a fraction of a second, I saw something flash across my mother's face. Not disappointment, not sadness, panic. Then she forced another smile. "Oh, Emma, why do you always make everything so complicated?" I stood slowly, picked up my coat. "I'll let my attorney review it." Then I looked around the dining room one last time. Something caught my attention: a small black security camera mounted discreetly in the corner of the ceiling. Then another above the hallway entrance, another near the study door. Far more cameras than I remembered from previous visits. I smiled to myself. Nobody else seemed to notice them. As I walked toward the front door, my mother called after me. "If you leave now, don't expect this opportunity again." I didn't turn around, because something told me this dinner wasn't the most important part of the evening. It was whatever happened after I walked out. And judging by the number of security cameras quietly watching that house, someone besides me was about to remember every single word. I spent my first 7 years believing my family looked exactly like everyone else's. There was a white house outside Boston, a swing in the backyard, my father's study that always smelled like coffee and old books, my mother's flower garden that she cared about more than almost anything, and my little sister Sophie, who followed me everywhere because she thought I knew everything. At least that's how I remember it. Memory has a funny way of protecting children. It softens the edges. It hides the moments that don't make sense until you're old enough to recognize them. When I was 7, everything changed in a single weekend. Nobody explained why. Nobody asked what I wanted. My parents simply packed 2 small suitcases, drove 4 hours north to coastal Maine, and left me at my grandmother Grace's farmhouse. Mom hugged me quickly before getting back into the car. "You'll stay with Grandma for a little while." "How long?" I asked. She smiled without answering. Dad kissed the top of my head. "Be good." Then they drove away. I waited on the porch until their car disappeared around the bend. I honestly believed they'd come back the following weekend. They didn't. A week became a month became a year. Eventually, I stopped asking Grandma when my parents were coming to get me. Because every time I asked, she looked as though someone had broken her heart all over again. Grandma Grace never tried to replace my parents. She simply filled every empty space they left behind. She taught me how to bake bread from scratch, how to grow tomatoes, how to repair a fence after winter storms. She insisted that every problem had a solution if you were patient enough to look for it. Most importantly, she taught me that love isn't something people promise. It's something they repeatedly choose. Every morning she woke before sunrise, made oatmeal, packed my lunch, waited on the porch every afternoon until my school bus appeared over the hill. When I had nightmares, she sat beside my bed until I fell asleep again. When I brought home report cards filled with A's, she taped every one of them to the refrigerator. Meanwhile, my parents built an entirely different life without me. They visited twice during my first year, 3 times the next. After that, birthdays were usually phone calls. Christmas became gift cards mailed in envelopes. Every conversation followed the same pattern. How's school? Good. We're proud of you. I miss you. We'll visit soon. Soon almost never came, but photographs did. Social media made sure of that. Pictures of family vacations in Florida, Sophie's piano recitals, holiday dinners, birthday parties, smiling portraits in matching sweaters. There was always one thing missing from every picture. Me. At first, seeing those photos hurt. Eventually, they simply became reminders that there were two different versions of the Brooks family, the one they lived and the one I watched from hundreds of miles away. Grandma noticed that too. One afternoon when I was 15, she found me staring at another family Christmas photo online. She quietly closed the laptop. Emma. I looked up. You know what the strongest trees have in common? I shrugged. They grow where they're planted. She smiled gently. You weren't abandoned because you lacked value. You were transplanted. So grow anyway. I never forgot those words. Maybe because she believed them long before I ever could. High school became my escape. I studied harder than anyone else because education felt like the only thing nobody could take away from me. Scholarships replaced expectations, part-time jobs replaced allowances. By the time graduation arrived, I'd earned admission to one of the country's best data science programs without asking my parents for a single dollar. Grandma framed my acceptance letter before I even packed for college. Mom sent a text message. Congratulations. That was enough to remind me where each of them stood in my life. College wasn't glamorous. While many classmates worried about internships and spring break trips, I worried about paying rent before tuition deadlines. I worked mornings at a campus coffee shop, afternoons in the university computer lab, weekends tutoring statistics. Some semesters I slept 4 hours a night. Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't afford not to. During my sophomore year, Grandma called me after watching a documentary about healthcare fraud. You know, she said thoughtfully, people always think stealing means taking cash. But sometimes, they steal from sick people. That conversation stayed with me. I began researching fraudulent medical billing systems, insurance abuse, false claims, hospital payment manipulation. The deeper I looked, the more I realized billions of dollars disappeared every year because nobody connected the data quickly enough. That became my obsession. By graduation, I'd already built the first prototype of an artificial intelligence platform capable of detecting suspicious billing patterns before human auditors noticed them. Most professors thought it was too ambitious. One investor disagreed. He offered enough seed funding for me to rent a tiny office in Portland. 3 desks, one coffee machine that barely worked, a whiteboard covered with impossible ideas. There were only 4 of us. None of us took real salaries during the first year. Every dollar went back into development. Twice, we nearly shut the company down. 3 times, our largest client almost walked away. Then one hospital network used our software and discovered nearly $20 million in fraudulent claims within 6 months. Everything changed after that. Contracts multiplied. Insurance companies started calling. Healthcare systems across the country wanted demonstrations. 8 years passed faster than I ever expected. Our little startup became one of the fastest-growing healthcare analytics companies in the Northeast. Then came the acquisition. Negotiations lasted almost 5 months. Lawyers, auditors, investment bankers, endless conference calls. The final agreement closed 3 weeks before my mother invited me to dinner. When the funds finally reached my account, I stared at the number for several minutes without moving. $58 million. Grandma was sitting beside me on the porch that afternoon. She didn't ask how much I'd made. She only smiled. I knew you'd build something worthwhile. That was the last long conversation we ever had. She passed away quietly 18 days later. After the funeral, I returned to her farmhouse alone to sort through her belongings. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Recipe books, photo albums, old quilts she'd sewn by hand. Then I opened the bottom drawer of the antique writing desk she'd owned for as long as I could remember. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name written across the front. Beneath it lay an old photograph. My mother, my father, a man I had never seen before, standing far closer to my mother than strangers ever would. Tucked underneath the photograph was a worn business card. Logan Reed, licensed private investigator. On the back, in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words. If they ever come back, start here. I read the sentence 3 times. Then I slowly looked toward the living room where Grandma's rocking chair still faced the window. For the first time since my mother's phone call, I realized Grandma hadn't been surprised they returned. She had been expecting it all along. The morning after my family's dinner invitation, I called the number on Grandma's business card. I wasn't even sure it still worked. The card had to be at least 15 years old. The edges were faded. The ink had begun to soften, yet the phone rang only twice before someone answered. Reed Investigations. The man's voice sounded calm, professional. My name is Emma Brooks. There was a brief silence. Then he asked a question that immediately made me sit up straighter. Did Grace finally tell you? No. She passed away 3 weeks ago. Another silence, longer this time. I'm sorry, he said quietly. So am I. I found your business card. And a note. I unfolded the piece of paper again. If they ever come back, start here. The line remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he exhaled. I wondered how long it would take. You knew my grandmother. For almost 20 years. She hired me. My heartbeat quickened. Hired you to do what? He answered without hesitation. To protect you. We agreed to meet that afternoon at a small coffee shop overlooking Portland Harbor. Logan Reed looked exactly like someone who had spent his career observing other people. Mid-60s, gray hair, simple navy jacket, nothing about him stood out, which I suspected was exactly how he preferred it. He waited until our coffee arrived before opening a worn leather briefcase. Inside were dozens of neatly organized folders. Every folder had a date, every date stretched back years. Grace never wanted revenge, Logan said. She wanted answers. He slid the first folder toward me. When your parents left you with her, she didn't believe the explanation they gave. They said Boston schools were better for Sophie. They said the farmhouse would give you a quieter childhood. He smiled sadly. Grace knew neither explanation made sense. So she hired me. I stared at him. For how long? He looked down at the files. Longer than either of us expected. One by one, he placed photographs across the table. My parents entering office buildings, meetings with attorneys, business registrations, financial statements, corporate records. It wasn't dramatic. There were no secret affairs, no hidden identities. Instead, there was something much stranger. Money. The same nonprofit organization kept appearing. Different years, different bank accounts, different shell companies, but always the same foundation. The Grace Sullivan Legacy Foundation. The very organization my mother wanted me to fund. I looked up. That's impossible. They only introduced the foundation last weekend. Logan nodded. That's what they told you. Then he opened another folder. Articles of incorporation. Filed. Almost 2 years earlier. I felt a chill run through me. They've been planning this. Yes. Long before they contacted you. Logan slid another document across the table. Projected operating expenses, executive compensation, consulting contracts. Almost every large payment eventually flowed toward companies controlled by the same 3 people: Victoria Brooks, Richard Brooks, and Sophie Brooks. I slowly leaned back in my chair. This isn't a charity. No, it's a business. A very expensive one. Logan nodded. And without a major outside donor, it won't survive. He didn't need to say the rest. I was the outside donor. The $500,000 wasn't about honoring Grandma. It was about keeping the foundation alive, and possibly keeping something much larger from collapsing. Over the next several days, Logan continued digging. The more records he uncovered, the more disturbing the pattern became. The Brooks family wasn't wealthy anymore. Not truly. They simply looked wealthy. The Boston house had been refinanced twice. Richard's consulting company had reported declining revenue for 3 consecutive years. Several investment accounts had quietly been liquidated, and the foundation itself had accumulated nearly $800,000 in unpaid obligations. "They're running out of time," Logan explained as we reviewed another stack of financial records. "They've delayed vendors, borrowed against future donations, moved money between accounts. None of that is illegal by itself. But together," he tapped the papers, "it tells a story." "What story?" "A family that's desperate for cash." My phone vibrated. Benjamin Cole. I answered immediately. "Emma, I've reviewed the proposal they gave you. And I found something." His tone became unusually serious. "The donation agreement isn't actually a donation." "What do you mean?" Benjamin continued. "Buried in the legal language, there's a clause giving the foundation extensive influence over future grants, strategic partnerships, and certain investment opportunities connected to your business interests." I frowned. "So if I'd signed, you wouldn't have just donated $500,000. You would have opened the door for them to influence much larger financial decisions." I closed my eyes. My mother hadn't wanted a contribution. She'd wanted access. That evening, another phone call arrived. This time it was Noah. "You need to come to Boston." "Why?" "The security company managing your parents' house contacted me. They're upgrading the surveillance server." "So?" He hesitated. "Because one of the technicians recognized my company logo on an old system." "What old system?" "The one your father insisted on installing 3 years ago." I frowned. "My father?" Noah's voice became quieter. "Emma, your parents' entire house has been recording synchronized video and audio for years." My pulse quickened. "I thought it was just motion cameras." "So did they. But your father requested continuous archive recording." I stood so quickly my chair nearly tipped over. "Does my family know that?" "No. They think only the exterior cameras record." I exchanged a long look with Logan. Neither of us spoke, because the same realization reached both of us at exactly the same moment. If my parents had spent years discussing money, my grandmother and me inside that house, there was a very good chance the cameras had quietly remembered every conversation they had already forgotten. I drove to Boston the following morning, not to confront my parents, not yet. I wanted to know whether the cameras actually contained anything useful before accusing anyone of lying. Noah met me outside the headquarters of Sentinel Integrated Security, the company that maintained my parents' surveillance system. He had already spoken with their legal department. "They won't just hand over recordings," he explained as we walked toward a conference room. "They're bound by privacy laws." "So why are we here?" "Because your father signed something unusual." Inside the room, a woman in a gray suit stood to greet us. "I'm Karen Mitchell, General Counsel for Sentinel." She slid a folder across the table. "3 years ago, your father upgraded the security system after a series of neighborhood break-ins." I nodded. "I remember hearing something about that." Karen opened the folder. "What most homeowners purchase is motion-activated recording. Your father requested something very different." She pointed to a highlighted paragraph. "Continuous recording. 24 hours a day. Video and synchronized audio." I frowned. "Why would he do that?" Karen hesitated. "He told our technician that if something ever happened to him, he wanted there to be an accurate record of conversations inside the house." Noah looked at me. "Your father wasn't thinking about burglars." Karen continued. "Unfortunately, because your parents currently occupy the property, we can't simply release years of recordings." "I understand. However," she slid another document toward me, Your father's trust contains a preservation clause. If litigation involving family finances becomes reasonably foreseeable, Sentinel is required to preserve all recordings from 30 days before the triggering event. My heartbeat quickened. The triggering event. Karen looked directly at me. The dinner where you were asked to contribute $500,000. I exchanged a glance with Noah. My father had planned even this, not the exact conversation, but the possibility that one day evidence might matter more than memory. Karen handed Noah an encrypted drive. These are the preserved recordings from the week surrounding your visit. They remain the property of Sentinel. You may review them with counsel present. 30 minutes later, Benjamin joined us. No one spoke as Noah connected the drive. The first recordings were ordinary. Breakfast conversations, television, phone calls, nothing remarkable. Then Noah clicked on the evening after I left the family dinner. The dining room camera activated. The timestamp read 9:42 p.m. I had been gone less than 10 minutes. Mom slowly closed the front door after watching my car disappear down the driveway. She walked back into the dining room. The smile she'd worn all evening vanished instantly. Richard poured himself another glass of wine. Sophie laughed. Well, that went exactly how I expected. Mom shook her head. No, it didn't. I thought she'd sign first. She's becoming too careful. Richard leaned back. So what's plan B? Mom answered without hesitation. We pressure her. Again. Sophie rolled her eyes. She's always wanted to be accepted. She'll eventually cave. Benjamin paused the recording. He quietly looked toward me. They're not discussing reconciliation. They're discussing strategy. Noah nodded. And we're only 5 minutes into the footage. He pressed play again. Mom opened the leather folder I'd refused to sign. She flipped through several pages before saying something that made my stomach tighten. If she had signed tonight, the foundation would have controlled every major grant she made. Richard smiled. And eventually, the rest follows. No one in the room looked surprised, as though this conversation had already happened many times before. Noah skipped ahead another 20 minutes. The dining room emptied. Richard carried the paperwork into my father's old study. Mom followed. Sophie closed the door behind them. A second camera automatically switched on. Unlike the dining room, the study felt smaller, more intimate. Books lined every wall. My father's old desk remained exactly where I remembered it. Mom sat in his chair. Richard remained standing. Sophie leaned against the bookshelf. No one realized a tiny security camera had been mounted above the grandfather clock. Mom sighed heavily. I never thought she'd become this successful. Richard shrugged. Neither did I. For years, she barely had enough money to pay rent. Sophie laughed quietly. Grandma filled her head with too much confidence. Mom looked down at the donation agreement. No. Grace filled her head with independence. And that's always been the problem. Silence settled across the room. Then Richard asked the question that changed everything. Do you ever regret sending her away? Mom didn't answer immediately. She stared toward the window for several seconds. Finally, she spoke. Every single day. My heart skipped. Not because of what she said, because of what she said next. But I couldn't let her stay. Richard lowered his voice. You still think she remembers? Mom shook her head. She was only 7. She shouldn't. Sophie looked confused. Remember what? My breathing became shallow. Benjamin slowly leaned forward. Noah stopped touching the keyboard. Everyone in the conference room instinctively knew the next few moments mattered. Mom looked directly at Sophie. There are things children aren't supposed to see. Richard quietly nodded. And Emma saw one of them. The room fell completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Mom whispered the sentence that explained 30 years of unanswered questions. The day she asked why she looked so much like her father. I knew she was starting to notice things. She closed her eyes. I panicked, so I sent her to Grace. I couldn't breathe. 7 years old. One innocent question. That was all it had taken to change my entire life. Sophie stared at her in disbelief. You told me she left because Grandma needed help. Mom looked away. That wasn't true. Richard rubbed his forehead. We thought distance would solve everything. Benjamin quietly muted the recording. Noah looked at me. Neither of them knew what to say. Neither did I. For 25 years, I'd believed I'd done something wrong, that I hadn't been lovable enough, obedient enough, good enough. But the cameras had just revealed something completely different. I wasn't sent away because of who I was. I was sent away because my parents were afraid of what I might eventually understand. And for the first time in my life, the truth wasn't coming from a family member. It was coming from a silent camera that had no reason to lie. For almost a full minute, nobody in the conference room spoke. The recording remained frozen on the image of my parents sitting inside my father's old study. My mother looked exhausted. My father looked defeated. Sophie looked as though everything she believed about our family had just been rewritten. Benjamin was the first to break the silence. I think we've reached the point where speculation ends. He looked directly at me. And evidence begins. I nodded slowly. For years I'd imagined confronting my parents, demanding answers, asking why. Now I realized something unexpected. I didn't need another explanation. The cameras had already given me one. Benjamin closed the laptop. I believe it's time they explain those statements in front of people who matter. 3 days later, formal mediation was scheduled. Not because anyone expected reconciliation, because my parents' attorneys still insisted there had simply been misunderstandings. Benjamin made sure the meeting included more than lawyers. The board of the Grace Sullivan Legacy Foundation attended, independent accountants, the foundation's outside auditors, several longtime donors who had personally known my grandmother. Even Logan Reed was invited as a witness. My parents entered the conference room looking remarkably confident. My mother wore the same composed smile she had perfected over decades. Richard carried a leather binder. Sophie walked several steps behind them, unusually quiet. Mom greeted everyone warmly. I'm so glad we're finally resolving all of this. Benjamin didn't return the smile. I hope so. He connected Noah's laptop to the large projector at the front of the room. The screen displayed a simple title, Sentinel Integrated Security Archive. My mother's smile disappeared almost immediately. What is this? Benjamin answered calmly. The truth. He turned toward the room. Before discussing donations, trusts, or financial statements, I'd like everyone to hear a conversation that took place after Emma left the family dinner. Without another word, he pressed play. The first clip showed exactly what we'd already seen. My mother discussing the donation agreement. Richard talking about gaining influence over my future investments. Sophie assuming I would eventually give in. Around the conference table, expressions began changing. One donor slowly leaned back in his chair. An accountant stopped taking notes. The chairman of the foundation folded his hands without saying a word. Then the recording reached the study. The room grew noticeably quieter. Everyone listened as my mother admitted she had sent me away because I had started noticing things. Richard quietly confirming that distance had been their solution. Then came the sentence no one in the room could ignore. I never thought she'd become this successful. The chairman looked sharply toward my mother. You were planning this before she ever arrived for dinner. No answer. Benjamin allowed the recording to continue. The conversation became even worse. Richard opened the financial projection for the foundation. If Emma contributes, we survive another 3 years. Mom nodded. And after that, the grants give us access to everything else. One of the outside auditors frowned. Everything else? Benjamin paused the video. I believe it's time to explain what that means. He placed several financial reports on the conference table. Colored tabs marked dozens of transactions. Over the last 23 months, the Grace Sullivan Legacy Foundation paid consulting fees to 3 privately owned companies. He slid another document forward. All three companies share the same mailing address. Another page. The same accountant. Another. And the same beneficial owners. He looked directly at my mother. Victoria Brooks. Richard Brooks. Sophie Brooks. The chairman's face turned pale. Those companies belong to your family. Silence. Benjamin answered for them. Yes. He turned another page. The foundation paid more than $1.8 million in consulting expenses. Yet investigators found no reports, no completed projects, no measurable services. One donor slowly removed his glasses. My God. Another board member whispered, So the charity was paying you? Benjamin nodded once. It appears so. Mom finally stood. Her voice was noticeably sharper now. Those were legitimate management fees. Benjamin remained perfectly calm. Excellent. Then you'll have no objection to a forensic audit. For the first time that afternoon, my mother looked genuinely frightened. Before she could answer, Logan quietly stood from the far end of the table. I believe everyone should see one final recording. He nodded toward Noah. Another camera angle appeared, this time from the study 2 nights after our family dinner. Only my parents were present. Richard looked worried. What if Emma starts asking questions? Mom answered almost immediately. Then we'll make sure nobody believes her. Richard frowned. How? Mom calmly replied. We've spent 25 years building our reputation. She spent 25 years living somewhere else. She smiled coldly. Who do you think people will believe? No one in the conference room moved. No one even seemed to breathe. The chairman slowly closed his folder. Then he looked directly at my mother. I've known Grace Sullivan for 30 years. His voice was quiet. And today, I finally understand why she never donated to this foundation. He stood. So effective immediately. I am requesting a full independent forensic audit. One by one, every board member raised a hand in agreement. The motion passed unanimously. My mother looked around the room in disbelief. The influence she had spent decades building collapsed in less than an hour. Not because someone accused her, because the cameras had quietly preserved every lie she thought had disappeared the moment the words left her mouth. The independent forensic audit began the following Monday. Unlike family arguments, audits don't care about emotions. They care about records, invoices, bank transfers, tax filings, corporate ownership. Every document either tells the truth or eventually contradicts another one. Within 3 weeks, the accounting firm submitted its preliminary findings. The Grace Sullivan Legacy Foundation had never operated the way donors believed. Nearly $2 million had been routed through consulting agreements awarded to companies secretly controlled by my parents and Sophie. Several invoices described strategic development services. No reports existed. Others referenced community outreach. No events had ever taken place. The foundation hadn't been created to honor my grandmother. It had been created to finance my family's lifestyle. The board immediately suspended every executive officer. Federal investigators became involved after discovering questionable interstate financial transfers connected to charitable funds. The Internal Revenue Service opened its own investigation. The Attorney General's office requested copies of every financial record. Then came the lawsuit. Not mine. The foundation itself sued my parents to recover misappropriated charitable assets. Several donors joined the action after learning their contributions had never reached the programs they believed they were funding. Benjamin represented me only as a witness. I wasn't seeking revenge. I simply answered questions. The evidence answered the rest. When the civil hearing finally began, the courtroom felt strangely familiar. Once again, Benjamin relied almost entirely on facts. He presented the accounting reports, corporate ownership documents, wire transfers, foundation meeting minutes. Then, he played the CCTV recordings, not because they proved financial fraud, because they proved intent. The judge watched my mother calmly discussing how my donation would keep everything alive. He watched my father explain that gaining influence over my future investments was part of the long-term plan. Finally, the courtroom watched the recording from my father's study. I never thought she'd become this successful. If Emma contributes, we survive another 3 years. The judge paused the recording himself. He looked toward my parents. These statements are inconsistent with every representation made to your donors. Neither my mother nor my father answered. There was nothing left to say. The financial records confirmed what the cameras had already suggested. Several months later, the final rulings were issued. My mother pleaded guilty to multiple counts involving charitable fraud and financial misconduct. She received a 5-year prison sentence, along with substantial financial penalties. Richard accepted responsibility for approving fraudulent transactions and entered a plea agreement in exchange for cooperating with investigators. He lost every professional license connected to nonprofit financial management. The foundation was dissolved. Remaining assets were redirected to legitimate charities through court supervision. As for Sophie, she wasn't criminally charged. Investigators determined she had benefited from the money, but had not directed the fraudulent accounting. Even so, every business partnership she had depended on disappeared almost overnight. Sometimes reputation leaves long before the courtroom does. People often ask whether I felt satisfied watching everything collapse. The honest answer is no. Justice and happiness aren't the same thing. Justice restores balance. It doesn't give you back the childhood you lost. It doesn't erase lonely birthdays. It doesn't replace the years spent wondering why your own parents chose someone else. The verdict ended a legal battle. It didn't erase the memories that started it. Two years later, I stood outside a completely different building, a renovated brick school overlooking Casco Bay in Portland, Maine. Above the entrance hung a simple bronze sign, the Grace Sullivan Foundation for Opportunity and Hope. Not legacy, not family. Opportunity. Inside, the classrooms were filled with students learning computer science, data analytics, and financial literacy. Several counseling rooms provided free mental health support for children growing up in foster care or with relatives. Every scholarship carried my grandmother's name. Every financial report was published publicly online. Every donation could be tracked down to the last dollar. Transparency wasn't just a policy, it was the promise I had made to the woman who raised me. Logan served on the Foundation's ethics committee. Benjamin remained our legal advisor. Even Noah volunteered each summer, teaching teenagers how digital evidence could uncover fraud and protect vulnerable people. One autumn afternoon, after finishing a board meeting, I drove past my parents' old house. It had been sold during the legal proceedings. The landscaping was different. The shutters had been painted blue instead of white. Children's bicycles rested near the front porch. For the first time in decades, it looked like a home. Construction workers were finishing a renovation near the garage. One of them climbed a ladder and carefully removed an old security camera from beneath the roofline. He disconnected the wires, lowered it into a cardboard box, then carried it away. I watched for a few seconds before smiling to myself. People usually think cameras exist to catch criminals. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they simply preserve ordinary conversations until those conversations become extraordinary evidence. That small camera hadn't destroyed my family. It hadn't exposed them. It hadn't judged them. It had only done what cameras have always done. It remembered. Long after the people inside forgot what they had said. As I drove away, I thought about something Grandma once told me while we watched the tide roll into the harbor. The ocean always returns what people try to bury. Back then, I thought she was talking about storms. Now I understood. The truth works exactly the same way. You can hide it, delay it, even convince yourself it's gone. But sooner or later, it always finds its way back to the surface. And when it does, no lie is powerful enough to pull it under again.
What makes this story unforgettable isn't the money, the lawsuit, or even the shocking CCTV footage. It's the painful realization that rejection can shape a person's life for years, while the truth behind that rejection remains hidden. Emma spent most of her childhood believing she wasn't good enough when in reality, she was carrying the consequences of choices she never made. That is a reminder that the way adults treat children can leave wounds that last far longer than anyone expects. The CCTV cameras also symbolize something important. They didn't invent evidence or create guilt. They simply captured honest moments when people believed nobody would ever hear their real thoughts. In private, Emma's parents revealed motives they had successfully hidden behind Smile's charity work and family traditions for decades. Their downfall wasn't caused by technology, it was caused by their own decisions. Grandma Grace may have left Emma very little in terms of money, but she gave her something far more valuable, the courage to seek the truth instead of accepting someone else's version of it. She taught Emma to build a life based on integrity rather than resentment. If there's one lesson this story leaves behind, it's this: your past does not define your worth. The people who fail to love you are not the measure of your value. Stay patient, protect yourself with truth and evidence, and remember that genuine character is revealed not by what people say in public, but by what they choose to do when they believe no one is watching.